Good morning. My name is Watson. I'm reviewing the sublime object of ideology, which is on chapter 1. Um, we're doing sections 10, 11, and 12. So that's Kafka, the critic of Althusser, fantasy as a support of reality, and surplus value and surplus enjoyment. I'm going to share a mind map so we can follow along in the text a little bit easier. This first section, Althusser is a philosopher and a student of Marx. He's known for his interpretation or his interpretations of Marx and how his views on ideology and how ideology sets in. When he has a famous paper about the ideological, what he calls the ideological state apparatus, where he describes how ideology sets in on like the human mind. And what Zizek does in this section is use Kafka to critique Althusser. So the main crux of the critique is that within the ideological state apparatus, there really isn't a way for the subject to become identified within the apparatus. So Kafka uses a lot of bureaucracy in his writing, and he kind of makes fun by saying like that you have this senseless large set of rules, which Lacan would call the big other, where the subject's confronted with those rules, and the subject has to wrestle with the senselessness of those rules. And Kafka never really provides a way. There isn't a straightforward way for the person to identify and find themselves within the rules. Lacan does provide such a way. He kind of describes something that could be called subjectification, and within subjectification, there's the big other kind of what he calls it's kind of a call to the subject, and this whole the whole thing when there's this subjectification, there's a kind of an antagonism, and what Lacan calls object petite a, that it kind of that and coincides with fantasy and a bunch of other things, which makes it to where the person kind of gets trapped within the ideology. So the review, you've got Althusser, who has this large like this ideological state apparatus, where the subject is overwhelmed or presented with these large sets of rules, and then he has what term that he coined called interpolation, where the subject locates themselves within the ideological state apparatus. But he doesn't say how that happens, at least to Zizek's, to what Zizek would like him to say. So Lacan, again, kind of has an answer for that. Zizek describes it multiple different ways. I think that might go over this first section, um, almost like it's a high level overview of the first section. He has some other examples within it where he talks about how Freud describes what a dream is and what people normally think of how dreams works. So you have let's say you have an external irritation. So like there's a fire going on in your room, and you have the common notion of how dreams work are it, it, there's a there's the dream kind of helps you to prolongs your sleep, and that's a kind of a Freudian way of looking at it, whereas Lacan has a totally different way where it's kind of the dream in a way kind of tries to keep you from the reality of, let's say, for instance, your guilt or what have you. When your guilt in your dream becomes too large, then you wake up in essence to continue dreaming, so that you don't have to confront the reality of your guilt, let's say. So, and Zizek doesn't actually say it in the book, but like his example, which is, um, kind of describing Freud's famous example of a man being confronted with his son, and his son is burning. Um, Lacan's interpretation of how dreams works, the sun burning and the guilt, and then the fire happening actually in real life, with inside of the man's room. The guilt coincides with the son's, with the man not being able to take care of the son. So, another concept within this section has to deal with how beliefs are or can be radically external. This has to do with the big other, or um, the set of rules that you're thrust into from the time that you're born, um, how they control you, and so that you can call it a symbolic machine. This set of rules, how you relate to those rules. It's essentially, the common idea is that it's all internal, and that you have beliefs, and those beliefs, originate from you with your, say if you believe in libertarian free will, humans create their own beliefs. Well, Lacan says, actually, the big other is what really constrains and gives you almost all of your beliefs. And he talks a little bit more about that in the next section, about how is it that we're able to not be completely alienated by the big other, so that we don't have any beliefs at all. So I think that's the total of part 10. Do you have any questions?
I do not.
All right. Let's go ahead and all right. Fantasy as a supportive reality. So Zizek is he's a self-identified Marxist and communist. So he uses a lot of examples from 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 Marx, and that he's going to use those examples, and it's kind of hard to follow if it's the first time reading anything along the subject, but he uses those as those very hard to understand examples to describe psychoanalysis. But I believe that um, I believe that they're good examples because those examples are part of the ideology that we have in the West. Um, so within the fantasy as a support of reality, there's the common conception of reality is you have your internal uh, mind and your beliefs and all these things, and then there's this external thing that's independent of your mind, and then that's reality. Well, Lacan and Zizek and other philosophers too, but they have this kind of third area where um, the two kind of meet, and you could call it a social reality or kind of reality with a small r, the real, which is outside of your social reality. Now, it can be confusing when you think about, well, why would you need two kinds of reality? And when you go to look at the reviews for the sublime object of ideology, the thing that people complain about the most um, is the description of the real, Lacan's description of the real and what it is. Why do we have to have two? Well, it's kind of there's a whole bunch of different ways to come at it, but social reality seems to be a little bit easier to understand than the real. The real is just that which cannot be symbolized. So that's almost paradoxical right there, because I just used the sentence as a to represent the real. So it seems like it can be symbolized. Um, but I think the point there is it's difficult to approach. Now and it causes all kinds of trauma. Now, social reality, which is what this section is touches on, it has a lot. It's how we wrestle with the real, how we support the real, how we when we encounter it, what happens to us. And Lacan's position is that you really within fantasy, which is separate than just a regular illusion, that's when we as subjects confront the real, and we kind of have you kind of, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but you kind of have it's the only place where we're not completely alienated from the big other. So you have all of these rules that are thrust on you. You get socialized with these rules. That's not really a controversial thing that you can have. You get your belief systems and stuff from your parents and your culture and all that. But where's the line drawn? And in the West, we kind of have this, belief that people have the ability to make their own choices and things like that. But how is it that happens? Lacan says just way down at the level of fantasy, that's where where we where the subject is created, and um that's all. That fantasy is uh, at its most real um, during the dream, where that's when you can actually really confront your the main drivers for why you do what you do. So you'll confront things like guilt. If you're an obsessional neurotic, you'll confront the guilt. If you're hysteric, you might confront disgust. Um, all other kinds of different neuroses. I guess there's perversion and there's psychosis. But within the dream, that's where that's paradoxically where things are the most real. So that layer is called social reality. Um, so so we have that portion of this section, and then what Lacan does to try to describe social realities, he uses um, kind of our a representation of what you could call like a boogeyman that continues to appear over and over again in history. And um, what Zizek uses to describe this is he uses people's a negative representation of the Jew or Jewish people. And to summarize, Zizek's explanation of why there's conspiracy theories related to Jewish people is those conspiracy theories are really to cover an antagonism, again, that which cannot be symbolized, so the real of of social reality or different social classes, which is again brings you back to Marx. So social classes not being able to find some type of harmony and some type of eruption. Um, when the antagonisms, um, when these problems arise, if you're a believer in the ideology of capitalism, you need some reason to explain why capitalism isn't smooth. Why isn't it working the way that you would think? How come it seems to be broken in whenever you you do your best to make it work? And so if you were to look at not only Germany in the 30s, but also really, you know, you could go back, 100 years before that. There's always some type of anti-Semitism going on, and but specifically within Germany, and you could even say, the West in general, anti-Semitism was all over the place. People were struggling to come up with the best way to build your economy. And when capitalism was and then the industrial revolution was happening and all these things like that, it was kind of okay. The smoothness isn't there. Everyone isn't completely doing well. So for instance, Germany, they were doing really bad, of course, with World War I. On the heels of World War I, they were hurting. And the common conception would be just, okay, Germany needed a scapegoat, and to try to come together, they used Jewish people to do it. But what Zizek is saying is it's actually a little bit, it's more complicated than that. Capitalism itself failed Germany, and they needed a boogeyman in order to in order to try to create like this fantasy layer. So essentially, you can think of the ideology as, okay, um, if there were no like stereotypical view of what German people were thinking in the 30s, was like, if there just wasn't any Jewish people, everything would be smooth. But because there are these manipulators or whatever conspiracy theory, things are not smooth. So we should be more nationalistic, um, and try to expel everything that's um, keeping us from having a good economy, keeping us from having a good country, and all these things like that. And I'll add on to that. It's not simply just you have a boogeyman and you need to expel this boogeyman. So like normal scapegoating. Hi, Seth, how's it going? But Zizek's position is that you also, at the level of experience, when you're caught in the ideology, in an ideology, experience, everything that you experience will actually turn into evidence for the ideology being true. So in 1930s Germany, you could be bombarded with all of this propaganda that Jews are bad, but in reality, people would go home and they would live next to a perfectly fine, normal Jewish person. Like they would really never come into contact with these images that you could that you would see. Like if you ever look at any of this propaganda, like Mein Kampf, there's a documentary on it, and you'd see some of these videos that they would have. And they would have these like images that look like vampires or something like that. It was really silly. And so people, they'd see something, and then they would go back home, and then you would see, someone that was Jewish living right next to them. And so right then you would think, oh, the experience should counteract the propaganda. But within an ideology, what happens is the experience becomes evidence for the ideology. So what would happen is people would see the normal looking Jewish person, and then they would say, oh yeah, that's right. It's because they're so sneaky and they're able to mix among German people. That's part of their part of the danger of the Jew. And so it becomes evidence for the ideology. So when people are caught, you can't just use experience, because the fantasy actually supports people's confrontation with the real and all this stuff. Again, the real in this situation being the fundamental antagonism within capitalism. All right. Any questions?
No, those were good examples.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. This is the surplus value and surplus enjoyment. This is the end of the chapter, and it is a bit complicated. But what Zizek does is he tries to line up Marx and Lacan and their differences and similarities, and then tries to interpret Marx in light of Lacan. And in the end, he ends up saying that Marx did not account for what Lacan calls the surplus object. Right? So we talked about this before in some of the previous videos. So you've got Marx, who says that the fundamental problem within ideology of, say, for instance, capitalism, is when humans overlook the totality of social relations. Right? But within Lacan, you've got Lacan has the idea of what a totality is, and it's a little bit closer to what I guess Hegel was envisioning. And so the totality is set on effacing the traces of its own impossibility. So a totality being, like we talked about before, being a set of elements, and then there's one element that's kind of the exception to the rule. But paradoxically, that element is what allows the totality to exist. So that's the first kind of a similarity, and then also a difference. Now, then you've got Marx's view of what a fetish is, and a fetish conceals the positive network of social relations. Again, commodities actually needing or supposedly representing social relations, but then to regular humans, they're thinking that the commodity is a relationship between things. Um, so that's Marx, and then you've got a Freud, which a fetish conceals the lack or castration around which the symbolic network is articulated. So again, from the time that someone's born, there are all of these rules that create this network, and you have the situation where you have the mother and the father, and then you have a certain a moment when the child becomes separated from the mother, and then the child starts to have this concept of what a lack is, and then of course you've got the idea of castration, which it doesn't just mean castration of the phallus in the normal sense of the phallus, but it also means um, um, all kinds of other things. But then you've got how the critique occurs from Marx and Lacan. So you've got within Marx is preoccupied with how the particular gets changed into a universal, and then that's the cause of all kinds of problems, conceptual problems. So Marx his way of critique is to denounce the false externalization of, or to denounce false externalization or false universalization. Now, Lacan wants to denounce over rapid historicization. So, Lacan believes that the real is something that's going to pop up over and over again in history, whereas and so that represents a traumatic kernel in our social systems and things like that. So for Lacan, you would say concentration camps, like Zizek uses the example of concentration camps appearing over and over within history, and it's again he blames capitalism as the fundamental ideology, and concentration camps, which would be just the opposite of what like free markets you would think would produce, they pop up as a symptom over and over again. So saying that, so switching over to trying to describe Marx in Lacanian concepts, Marx is on the level of the imaginary, and Marx says that over rapid universalization creates a quasi-universal image, again, like German law and Roman law, are particular forms of law, but then you could have the law with capital L, and that would be a universal law. And Marx saying that that's not a real thing, and it's the cause of all kinds of problems. So the universal image makes us blind to the historical, socio-symbolic determination of the, which is a fundamental problem within an ideology. But Lacan says there's an over rapid historicization that makes us blind to the real, which makes us blind to the stuff that, to the thing that always returns to the same place. So again, the um, things happening like concentration camps and things like that. So the surplus object is supposedly unaccounted for by Marx. So this is surplus. Marx accounts for surplus value. So surplus value being something like, okay, you have a worker and well, I'm just going to say what surplus is. You have a worker and they make a widget for $6. That's how much it costs for the worker to make the widget, including labor, parts, all that. And then you've got the capitalist that sells the widget for $10. And the surplus is the $4. So that's kind of the Marxian concept. Whereas it's the remainder, it's the leftover from some type of activity or something like that. So surplus enjoyment is when it, again, it's the, and using the term jouissance and all this stuff, it's the extra that happens after the encounter with the real. So Lacan describes surplus enjoyment. He accounts for surplus enjoyment in object petit a or object A. It's the cause of desire, and it's the thing that you can't actually grasp. So, and then Zizek goes into this description of capitalism and how the more common idea of what Marx view of capitalism is versus a more sophisticated view versus what Lacan thinks that or what Zizek thinks is unaccounted for by Marx. So people normally think of capitalism as some type of evolutionary procedure. The winners, that the more person that comes up with the best idea is the one that's going to win, or the best product's going to win, and the best countries win. And it's kind of, a simple way of thinking. But Marx kind of talks about form and content, and the relation of production precedes the development of productive forces, which is the content. So it's kind of the idea being that the form itself is destructive. So capitalism has this destructive part of its definition. It's built into the definition. It's always going to be imbalanced. It's always going to somehow fail and reinvent itself. But again, in the end, what Lacan says, well, you had all of that, but what you didn't have is a surplus object. And that's what Zizek says. So any questions there?
No, I don't have any questions. I think Seth might have, but he seemed to have audio. Was going in and out.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit easier to get on here with mobile. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this so that it can stay short. And that's the whole, I believe that's the last portion of that's the last portion of the chapter. So I hope people enjoyed it.
Thanks.